Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. This week, we're tracking the continued fallout from the war in Iran, which has strained Europe's energy security, its relationship with the United States, and the future of NATO itself. Then we'll turn to a conversation with Federico Steinberg, Prince of Astoria's Chair at Georgetown University and visiting fellow here at CSIS, on the war's economic costs for Europe. Let's get into it.
Max, there's still a lot going on because of everything happening in Iran, but in Europe, a lot of jitters are now coming up because of the energy security issue in particular. Can you walk us through the dynamics that we're seeing?
Yeah, we should say that we're recording on April 7th at 10:21 a.m. Eastern Time. Donald Trump has basically threatened Iran with civilizational erasure. Not Europe this time, but Iran, threatening to bomb power plants and other infrastructure. And I think the question is that if he follows through with that, I mean, that would sort of amount to a war crime, or not sort of, it would amount to a war crime. But I think the concern in Europe would also be that the war is definitely going to be prolonged, but also a potential for massive civilian impacts, refugee crisis impacting Europe. And so, this war is already being brought home. We are seeing Dan Jorgensen, the EU Energy Commissioner from the great country of Denmark, from where our producer Otto hails from, basically warning this week that prices are not going to return to normal and that Europe needs to start preparing for the long haul. We've also seen a warning from the economy commissioner noting that Europe doesn't have the same fiscal space as it had before the last energy crisis. And so the same sort of subsidy regimes that were put in place after the energy crisis in 2022 might not be applicable. But we are seeing things like in Italy, where there's basically a gas tax holiday being put in place until May. Spain is doing something similar, trying to reduce the impacts on consumers. And I think on the one hand, this sort of short-termism makes sense. Like, this is an abrupt energy crisis. On the other hand, this is not going to end anytime soon. So if you're doing a gas tax holiday and you're not, working to sort of crush demand or reduce demand, you're basically just creating, major budgetary effects and not facilitating the kind of transition that would reduce inflation. And transition doesn't just mean to, buy EVs, but encouraging people to drive less and other things. I guess what I would say here, the basic hot takeaway from my view, is that I think Europeans have been slow to realize that this is an epic crisis. And therefore, they need measures not just about gas tax holidays for a couple months, but need to start thinking in sort of much bigger terms in next-gen EU style approaches. The next generation EU was done in response to COVID to prevent sort of an economic crisis in Southern Europe effectively. Now, there's questions about how impactful that was, but I think big joint approaches are needed. For example, Federico Steinberg and I wrote a piece for CSIS calling for bigger approaches. But if you look at a country like Bulgaria, 70% of the vehicles on the road are over 15 years old, right? They're older cars. They're all gas-powered cars. Bulgaria also has one of the lowest EV adoption rates. And you have a German car industry that is really struggling. One of the things that we did here in the US after the great financial crisis was there was a cash for clunkers deal where you could trade in your car, you could get a new one that was to help survive the Detroit car sector. You could see creative approaches like that. It has to work differently, obviously, in the EU because EU can't go direct to consumers. But there is, I think, a need for big, bold policy approaches that have a very long-term approach to avoid the kind of short-termism of just trying to struggle through this crisis if it's going to end very soon. I think we're looking at least the energy analysts, really high energy prices for the next year at the very least, and potentially for much longer. One thing, if we go back to the 2022 energy crisis, was the speed at which Germany operated. Like, Germany did not have an ability to import LNG prior to the war. And then suddenly gas was being cut off. Germany, in a matter of weeks, figured out ways to import LNG. And I think a similar approach is needed now regarding this energy crisis. How can you reduce gas demand? How can you reduce oil demand? Are there quick fixes? Is there enough inventory to change over, cab fleets from gas powered cars to EVs? Anything that can sort of reduce demand, because if you're reducing your oil consumption, you are reducing inflation. And I think that the danger, as Federico pointed out in this piece, is that, what happens is that inflation starts to go up, then suddenly people that aren't maybe driving or impacted, well, prices of everything go up. And so then they ask for higher wages. And that just leads to a stagflationary period. And that's what we saw in the 1970s. And the only way to really crush stagflation was to dramatically increase interest rates and basically crush the economy. And so if you're Europe, you want to really avoid getting in a stagflationary trap. So anything to reduce inflation. And what can reduce inflation? Well, not consuming natural gas and oil. And lo and behold, unlike in the 1970s, there are, electric vehicles, there are heat pumps, there are ways to begin to crush demand. And what we saw, and the debate about this is just really bizarre. Everyone just thinks that you immediately have to turn to coal. And I think in some ways we're going to see a resurgence in coal as we saw in 2022, but that's immediately dropped off. What we actually saw was a massive increase in Europe in the deployment of renewables. At the beginning of the war in 2022, Europe's energy generation, the share from different mixes of sources, fossil fuels were 40% of Europe's energy generation in 2022. Renewables were 20%. And where they are now is renewables have overtaken fossils. So renewables are now 30% and fossils at 29. There was a real uptick, especially in the first few years of the war. And that has left actually Europe in a much better position to cope with this energy crisis. And in fact, you could also say from a policy perspective, Europe is probably the most prepared around the world to deal with such an energy crisis because they already dealt with it. They dealt with one 4 years ago. So in the lifespan of these policymakers. And so what does Europe need to do? I think more of what it was doing in the first few years in the aftermath of the war. And that requires some short-term subsidies to German chemical companies and other things like that, because you don't want these companies to die. But really what they need to do is accelerate the energy transition. And that could also mean nuclear. The problem is it takes a long time for nuclear power plants to be built. If you can expedite that, great, but you don't necessarily want to cut corners there when it comes to permitting. Maybe you do. I know maybe there's ways to shorten the time frame, but you can buy a lot of cheap solar panels and deploy them fairly quickly. Your car companies can produce EVs. There needs to be a little bit of a can-do attitude here and not viewing it as we just got to get to May and then everything is going to be resolved. Because I think those countries and regions that take a slightly longer term approach here, that this is going to be a year-long crisis, if not potentially longer, or at least it's going to be sticky in terms of getting out of this crisis, I think we'll be much better off in the medium term.
Another collateral damage of this whole thing has been the intra-NATO relationship. President Trump recently called NATO a paper tiger, and there's been a lot of tension because Spain, for example, has closed its airspace and bases to US planes. Italy didn't want to let US planes that were involved in offensive operations use the airbase at Sigonella. France denied overflight for weapons shipment to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this keeps escalating. Obviously, Trump often sees these things as pretty transactional, and he thinks it's a boost for everyone what they're doing in Iran and doesn't understand why NATO countries in Europe would not help. So that's creating a severe pain point. Not that things were peachy before, obviously, but things seem to be getting worse really fast and more damage is happening. And I'm curious if you feel like there's some comparisons here to maybe 2003 type tensions, or if we're even worse than that.
Oh, I think it's much worse than 2003 in many respects, in part because there was at least, a bunch of half of Europe or a lot of Europe did support the US effort in Iraq. I'm not saying that side was right about the discussion, but in this case, who's in favor of this war in Iran? And I think where we are is the United States is in a total mess, and Trump wants to blame someone for why we're in this mess. You always need someone to blame if you're in a mess. And NATO, for some reason, is the easy punching bag for everyone in this administration, NATO and the European Union. And I think, the United States started this war without telling anyone that we were doing it, without engaging our NATO allies and partners and even asking them about whether they wanted to participate or talking with them. And now it's sort of our sort of scapegoat of saying, why don't you just open the strait? We've done all the hard work for you. We're not going to send our Navy anywhere close to the strait because we know could be sunk. So
we should say it's also ironic that this is worse than before, because from the Secretary General's report 2 weeks ago, in 2025, all the allies reached 2% of GDP on defense for first time since the 2014 commitment. So it's kind of this split screen image that we're seeing.
yeah, when you're the drunk guy at the bar and you want to fight someone and NATO's sort of sitting over there in the corner. I mean, it's out of nowhere, but it made it into Trump's presidential address that he gave to the country where he blamed Europe for not siding with the US. We're seeing some on the kind of far right influencer side really blasting NATO for its weakness and fecklessness. So all of that is being ramped up again, very much like the freedom fries from the Iraq days. There's a little bit less venom toward Europe than during Iraq, in part because the country was actually very unified in going to war with Iraq. It's very disunified when it comes to this war. But I think this is going to be a major source of tension. I don't know what happens with the NATO summit in Turkey this summer. Does that happen? But, when the Trump administration came to office, I wrote a piece about the coming collisions in transatlantic relations. And the basic argument was that like everything is a potential collision point, and this is the latest one. 6 weeks ago we were talking about Greenland. Now it's Iran and the Strait. It could be something else in another week or so. And I think this is why it's increasingly becoming important for Europe to think about having a common foreign security policy. In the Maastricht Treaty that was agreed to in the early 90s, they created the hope that there would be a common foreign security policy. What they effectively did is just say that there would be basically this multilateral organization appended to the European Union that would, so to speak, have a common foreign security policy, meaning that there was no way of actually the EU having one unless there's unanimity between all the countries agreeing. And if you get everyone to sort of agree on the same statement, well, that's a pretty blah statement, and it's not going to say very much. And there's been a push by Germany and the German foreign minister to move away from unanimity on EU foreign policy in this term of the commission, which ends in 2029. And I think we could see a push after the Hungarian election to say, okay, how are we doing foreign policy in Europe? Wouldn't it be better if we could actually just move forward on things and not everyone has to agree? And it can be like other pieces, other forms of legislation. This is obviously going to be very difficult for a lot of countries, particularly the smaller countries. But look, if you're Estonia and you want to have a solid Russia policy and everything is getting stuck because there's one random election that goes the wrong way, and maybe that's in Slovenia with 2.2 million people and they elect a far right guy that's kind of crazy about a certain topic. Maybe it's a far left person in another election. You can't run a foreign policy that way, where at every corner there's an election that could upend the ability for Europe to speak with one voice. And if you want to speak with one voice consistently on the world stage, you got to get rid of unanimity. And I think this is a smart push by the Germans. And I think this is about countries, do you want to hang together or do you want to hang separately? Do you want the European Union to be able to speak with one voice and be a powerful actor on the world stage or not? Because it's simply not going to be, and it's not going to have any presence on Middle East policy unless it can speak with one voice. We already talked about von der Leyen getting all this crap for calling Gulf leaders in the wake of the attacks, but like, what is supposed to happen in Europe when it comes to foreign policy unless you get rid of QMV? And this is, I think, something that we'll see a lot more of potentially after the Hungarian election.
Yeah, probably. Definitely the conversation is going to pick up. But as you said, I think there's going to be several member states who will want to talk about this in the opposite way and say, we are not doing this. Now is not the time. And you could make an argument, I'm not doing the work for them, but that democratic representation is having to agree on all these things, even after one random election goes another way. But the big election that we're all looking at, which might seem random to some people, but we've all been staring at for a while and will be staring at over Sunday, April 12, obviously is in Hungary. Things continue to be really interesting over there, not just because the vice president of the United States is visiting Budapest as we are recording this, but also over the weekend, we heard from Serbian authorities that they found an explosive device near a pipeline that's close, or by a pipeline that's close to the Hungarian border. Obviously, some figures of the Orban government quickly ran to say maybe this was Ukraine. Serbian authorities actually say actually it's not. So there's still a lot going on, but I think it's really important to highlight that the vice president is there a few days before the election, and that's not nothing. He obviously is saying that it's not just to campaign for Orban, but just to show their support, the closeness between the United States and Hungary. It's the American Hungarian Day of Friendship. This is the highest level visit in 10, 15 years at least from a US official. And it comes on the heels of the Secretary of State having been in Budapest in February at a time where almost every day there are articles coming out about Orban's links to Russia. Even again this morning, about like Bloomberg leaked some tapes of his conversations with Putin, of the foreign minister's conversations with Sergei Lavrov. So it's just a really strange dynamic where Vice President Vance is out there saying that Hungary works towards the United States' vision for Europe and supports its policy, at the same time as Orban is doing a lot of things that are actually quite against American interests.
Yeah, I mean, we're directly interfering or involving ourselves in a political election in another country to try to sway the outcome in a way that I can't really remember happening in Europe. And you could point to Barack Obama going at the invitation of David Cameron before the Brexit referendum as an example of that. And I think the White House later regretted that, but it was at Cameron's request. And I guess this is at Orban's request. But in this case, like, we are taking the side of Orban, who is clearly being helped by the Russians, where his government is clearly in cahoots with the Russians, has been sharing information. Budapest has become a center for Russian espionage. It's their kind of way into the European Union, undermining Ukraine. And, right now, Hungary is stopping the EU from funding Ukraine, right? Like, that is what they're doing. And okay, you don't like Ukraine, but we're not funding Ukraine. So does Vance just want Ukraine to have no money, to just be completely cut off? Why doesn't he ask Hungary to lift its veto? And what this really shows is that we're not on the side of democracy either in Ukraine or in Hungary, I would say, because it is clear that Hungary has become an electoral autocracy. I think it's probably an overstatement to say it's not a democracy. It's having elections, but the whole system is clearly rigged in favor of the ruling party. And this has been demonstrated in election after election and lots of research and studies. Anyway, where we are is that Orban looks set to lose this election and potentially lose it badly. Here you have JD Vance coming to, back Hungary and back Orban. And in doing so, I think is likely going to have real egg on his face for coming in, intervening. And all the Hungarian pollsters say that, Trump is not popular, Vance is not popular. Peter Magyar, the opposition leader, has called this direct election interference. And so I don't think this is going to work. And instead, what it does is it makes us incredibly anti-EU, anti-European, European in the air quotes of supporting the European project. Jacob Hellberg, the undersecretary for the economic affairs, also went to Brussels last week and just gave a speech that was basically just like trashing the EU, but then saying that we love the EU. I don't know, maybe the kids call this negging or whatever, that we talk so much crap about you, but we actually like you. It doesn't work. Right? Could you imagine a European leader coming to America and starting a conversation and saying, yeah, you're all fat and you die early and you have so many guns. And I mean, this is what we're doing in Europe. It's incredibly offensive. And meanwhile, the Hungarians, if the EU was so bad, they have a way out. Like, they could leave. But there is a reason why they don't do that. One is Brussels provides them a ton of money, and Orban is desperate for that money. The second thing is that the Hungarians don't want to leave the European Union. That would be incredibly unpopular. That would be economically ruinous. And Hungary is now one of the most corrupt, one of the poorest, countries in Europe where its economy has not grown over the last 4 years. So that's the model of success for the rest of Europe. It's just totally absurd what the US is doing right now and really putting the United States on the side of our adversary in Russia, a Trojan horse in Viktor Orban inside the European Union that is undermining EU support for Ukraine. And we have told the Europeans, take charge of Ukraine. That's your problem. And then here's this Trojan horse that is preventing the European Union from taking charge of Ukraine. So it's completely contradictory. It's all over the place. Our policy towards Europe oftentimes doesn't make sense. And this is a bipartisan critique, but it really doesn't make sense right now in this administration.
Yeah, it is kind of a crazy situation. I recently published a piece that was an exercise of thinking about scenarios for what happens after the election, depending on the results and depending on the response that we get from different actors. And having to think about where the US would be, depending on those scenarios, was a very strange thing to do because you kind of had to reach the conclusion that, let's say, Orban, if the result is too close immediately after the election and Orban tries to flood the zone with disinformation, realistically, this US administration would try to support that effort.
Yeah, when we talk about collisions coming in the transatlantic relationship or potential landmines that could explode the transatlantic relations, the Iran war is one, Greenland, and now Hungary, where if Orban tries to steal it or refuses to leave power, or some other steps are taken after the fact, I think it could be very explosive in transatlantic relations. And could have a real protest situation, a situation like Maidan in Kyiv. And, the Hungarians that we've talked to on this podcast and I've heard in other podcasts are sort of downplaying that potential scenario. But I do think Magyar sort of showed that he does have a card to play there, that it's not all in Orban's control. And so, Orban, I think, is basically trapped and running out of options. And so we'll see what happens. But if he tries to do something that is very explosive or causes a Hungarian population to react, I could see the US taking Orban's side, the EU basically being like, this is an Article 7 situation where we're going to basically move to not kick Hungary out of the EU, but ban it.
Suspend their rights.
Suspend their rights. That would, I think, also lead to a transatlantic rupture. Why don't we leave it there? Let's turn to our conversation with Federico Steinberg. I'm delighted to have Federico Steinberg here on the show. Federico, welcome back. Federico is the Princess Storius Visiting Professor at Georgetown University. He's also a senior fellow with Elcano, and most importantly, he is a visiting fellow here at CSIS. Federico, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
We are recording on Wednesday, April 8th, and last night, Donald Trump announced that there's going to be negotiations. The Strait of Hormuz is apparently going to be reopened. Everything is very unclear about where things are headed. We wrote a piece in the midst of the war, as it was still clear that it looked like it was going to go on for a long time, about Europe needs bold economic action in the face of the Iran shock. I still think that is the case because I think this is probably going to have a long tail in how it drags out. But maybe the first part of our conversation, we can focus a bit about how the war in Iran has impacted Europe's economic prospects. You are a macroeconomist. What has been the war's impact on the European economy?
Yes, so let's think about what the situation was right before the war started, mid-February. And basically, we had the European economy starting to accelerate its economic growth from a base which was relatively low for international standards, less than 1% growth with some regional differences, Spain growing more than 2.5%, Germany, France, Italy growing less. But overall, because of fiscal expansion, the increase in defense spending and other elements, growth was, accelerating, and things were looking better than the previous years in the Eurozone as a whole. And inflation was under under This was the situation with barrel of oil at $66, more or less. And then we have the war, the 6 weeks in which oil prices have been very volatile, but reaching peaks above $110 a day. Energy is also crucial in terms of gas for Europe. We remember what happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And gas prices doubled in some areas, getting to 60 euros per megawatt hour. So this is really something quite traumatic for the European economy. And again, we have regional differences, but the lack of very good interconnections inside the union and the lack of a clear energy union, which is something we discuss in our piece as well, made the situation clearly deteriorate. The OECD revised growth and inflation figures. So basically, growth down and inflation up with a lot of uncertainty, half a point, which basically raised again this specter of the risk of stagflation. So very slow growth with accelerated inflation, which is the worst scenario because then monetary and fiscal policy cannot really act well. And finally, now what we can say is that oil prices are around 90 barrels a day. Gas prices came down a bit, but the situation remains very uncertain. And most analysts would agree that the ECB, for instance, is not going to be able to cut interest rates in the future. On the contrary, perhaps it will need to raise them because inflation is going to go above the 2% target, probably to 2.5 or even higher, and growth is going to slow down. Now, this is quite problematic for the European economy as a whole in a context of basically demographic pressures, the need to spend more on defense and on climate transition, and also on competitiveness. Because basically, to wrap up, what the European Union needs is to grow faster. Once it has higher economic growth, there's going to be more resources to make the debt more sustainable, to target the groups that need some support because of the high energy food prices, etc. And then a big question mark is what is going to be the impact on global supply chains in the next months because of the war in Iran, and to what extent the ceasefire is something that is permanent or not.
Yeah, it seems it was in some ways the perfect storm for Europe. Yet it does also strike me that the path towards greater energy security and economic growth could be connected, and that's what we argue in this piece, because Europe is devoid of fossil fuels. I mean, in some cases, it's deliberately decided not to access them, such as the huge gas field in the Netherlands, which it's just decided because of some tremors that they're not going to access. But Europe actually produces a lot of the clean technology that is critical for the energy transition. It has a whole car sector that is really struggling, facing Chinese pressure. And I guess the question is, do you think there's an ability to both address both of these at the same time through industrial policy in some ways, creating incentives to accelerate the clean transition, as well as addressing energy security? And we sort of throw out the idea of a next gen EU too, thinking about, joint borrowing and using fiscal policy to really push Europe forward. I guess the question is, how would that be effective in this case? And would that be inflationary? Is that something that in a climate where energy prices are high, does that just fuel inflation? How do you think about that problem?
Yeah, so one of the key lessons, I think, from this energy crisis that comes on top of the one we had 4 years ago with the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that for the European Union, energy transition now is a geopolitical necessity. It's not just a climate thing, right? So basically, the European Union would be much better off on this traditional trilemma of how you should think about energy policy, where you need energy to be relatively cheap, so competitiveness, you need sustainability on the long run, and you need energy security. Now it's clear that the energy dependency of European countries makes security much more complicated with these new choke points that we have discovered in the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz, but also with the weaponization of energy exports and gas exports in particular by Russia. This is going to be more expensive or more volatile. So in terms of competitiveness, this matters. And of course, the climate transition, which European governments and public opinion still support as one of the key goals, right? So this is probably a great opportunity for thinking about pan-European programs to accelerate the energy transition on top of what was achieved in the previous mandate by the European Commission from 2019 to 2024, in which the Green Deal was the big thing. But now, every time we've seen that there's a discussion about issuing joint debt. There's a big opposition, understandably, but by northern countries. So, okay, why are you going to be issuing tons of Eurobonds? I mean, I think there's an economic and a geopolitical case to be made in the context in which some countries and central banks want to diversify out of the dollar because of uncertainty in the US, independence of the Federal Reserve, you name it, a bunch of arguments there. But basically, that's politically difficult to do. It's, I would say, it's unfeasible to issue, as we proposed in a previous paper, euro bonds that amount to 5% of the European GDP and replace it with national debt. So it's not increasing the debt. Angel Ubide and Olivier Blanchard have a good paper, a proposal about this, the Peterson Institute. So this idea is floating around, but it's very difficult to be effective or politically feasible. What can work, and I think we can take lessons from American fiscal integration here, is that every moment in which you have a specific need that is a European public good that you need to finance, there's a case to be made that you can issue Eurobonds for that. That was the case with Next Generation EU during COVID. That was the case in December by supporting Ukraine. Again, this was Eurobonds by only 24 countries, not 27. Again, a very original solution from European lawyers. And probably there's a case to be made now, even though, as you mentioned, the urgency might disappear in the next weeks because the war has stopped, to push for the energy transition in some sort of way in which there would be a European package. Then we have to discuss how that would go to member states, to citizens, to companies, to, on the one hand, push and accelerate the energy transition and combine that with industrial policy, as the Commission has proposed in a number of papers, to try to increase competitiveness and go to tackle some of the issues that the Letta and Draghi report put on the table a couple of years ago. So probably there's a case to be made. The problem probably is going to be that the urgency might be gone, and therefore they're going to be focused on other issues. But this is something that, as we argue in the paper in more detail, should be taken into account.
When it comes to Eurobonds and joint borrowing, what is the economic assessment of NextGen EU? Was that successful? How is it perceived economically? Because that, was the Europe crossing a Rubicon. It was generated in 2020 in response to the COVID crisis and the sense that this was going to really slam countries, especially in Southern Europe. Where's the kind of current understanding of that?
Yeah, so we remember the Next Generation EU was a program of up to 750 billion euros, which sounds like a lot in terms of the size of the European economy. Is not that large. It's less than 1% of GDP. But anyway, this was, for some people at the time, was kind of the European Hamiltonian moment, resembling, again, US history. It has not been the case because it has been a one-off. And there are mixed feelings about it. So on the one hand, the European Commission is quite satisfied with it because this has allowed the Commission to come to European public opinion as part of the solution and not part of the problem. So it's not part of the bad guys of the Troika during the Eurozone crisis imposing austerity on countries. Now it's a better model by which countries do reforms and investments that are paid by the joint borrowing by the Eurobonds, but in a negotiated and agreed way with the Commission. So basically, they are paid to make some reforms, which are politically difficult. So this kind of solves the political economy problem. On the other hand, I would say that it has not worked as a countercyclical fiscal program because most of the money arrived later than when it was needed in 21, 22. Next Gen EU is running up until this year, and probably some of the money is going to be disbursed in 2027, 2028 because of the amounts and the big difficulties with spending that much amounts. The same happened in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance. Capacity of the administrations was not, big enough. And then you have the traditional tensions between the big recipients, which were Italy, Spain, and then in per capita terms, also some of the Eastern European countries, and some of the countries that were contributing more than European countries, in part Germany, but not only. And Germany is probably not critical to the program in general because this tends to have this wider view of the European economy as a whole, and also the need to move forward and deepen integration. But some countries in the north say, okay, this was a one-off. It was necessary. We did it. We didn't want to break the single market, which was at risk during COVID. But let's be cautious about repeating this again and again. Now, the thing is that once the European Union starts to do something, it normally keeps on doing it. So it's quite likely that we will see some sort of mini joint borrowing, as we've seen again with Ukraine in the next years. And the point we make in the paper is that energy transition is clearly one of these potential objectives.
Yeah, I've been a big advocate for joint borrowing for defense. I think it makes a lot more sense than to have one big pot of money than Europeans all just, spending separately and not really coordinating their efforts. There's a lot of complaints from Europeans about the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act basically provided huge amounts of money, energy subsidies to consumers. It was a form of industrial policy to accelerate the clean transition. I got some of the subsidies myself when I bought an EV before Trump canceled them last September, as well as installing solar panels and heat pump hot water heaters, all sorts of incentives to electrify homes, electrify vehicles, and create energy efficiency. And it strikes me that one of the things that we've seen in Europe is a real increase in renewables, but the share of electrification throughout the economy, switching from, gas boilers to heat pumps, switching from gas cars to EVs, it's happening, but not at the same rate of growth as one might expect. And so hence European oil consumption is quite high, and that there could be an opportunity here in this crisis. We point to Bulgaria, 70% of the cars on the road are over 15 years old. It's one of the poorest countries in Europe, that perhaps you could create incentives for, the poor Bulgarians to buy German EVs, and sort of the northern states win, as well as you're accelerating the energy transition and therefore impacting inflation and over the short or probably more of the medium term. What's your take on the challenges for Europe, for the EU to begin to instigate something like this at a European level? Because in some ways it's sort of happening at various national levels, but it doesn't feel very integrated or coordinated.
Yes, absolutely. As you mentioned, some of these subsidies for EVs or solar panels already exist in a number of European countries, financed by their own governments. Part of Next Generation EU actually require around 40% of the projects to be related to energy transitions, the other 40% to the technological revolution related investments. But it's very chaotic and uncoordinated. And also, we should mention that in response to the war in Iran, some countries have approved some reductions in the taxes on electricity, for instance. This has been coordinated by the Commission, but every country has done more or less whatever they wanted. What you are arguing for makes a lot of sense. So having a big pot of money at the Brussels level, at the federal level, and use that to push for the energy transition, and also for the citizens to see that the money is coming from a European source, which would increase this perception that the EU is doing something for them specifically that is different from what their own fiscal policy on their country is doing. And this could be useful for the perception of usefulness of the European Union, which now is under big criticisms, particularly by extreme right parties. The problem is of the way the European fiscal policy functions, right? So ideally, we would need a European treasury, a European fiscal capacity, a larger European budget to think about how to distribute these funds. Because the problem we have now is that basically the Commission either borrows with Eurobonds or borrows on its own, gives loans to member states to spend on these things, which at this particular point are not necessarily cheaper than the capacity of the countries to finance themselves in the markets, because there's a lot of liquidity and interest rates are not high. Depends on the country. France has higher debt, but Italy has high debt. But anyway, the fiscal situation is not particularly problematic at this point. So the incentives for, a dramatic institutional change that is what wouldn't be required to do this properly, like you do in the US, where you have, tax deduction on your personal income tax with the IRS when you do your taxes at the US level, federal level, and not at the state level. This is kind of politically problematic at this point. We have the European budget negotiations, but again, This is a multi-year framework negotiation that is supposed to prepare a budget that's going to start in 2 years. So that's, a long shot. We need something faster and sooner. And unfortunately, I would say, the political situation in European countries is one that doesn't facilitate for this big push forward at this point.
Federico, I think that's a great segue. We're all going to be watching the Hungarian elections very closely coming up this weekend. And so we'll see. Maybe the political situation maybe there's a window over the rest of the year before the next French elections for some action. But Federico, thanks so much for coming on the Eurofile.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.